Hello everyone. My name is Alana. I'm the Restore Program Manager at Zero Foodprint. Also on this call is Jamie, our Grants Manager, and Elaine, our Operations Manager. And they're going to be helping with questions at the end. I'm going to present for about 25 minutes, and then we'll answer all questions at the end. But if they arise, feel free to pop them in the chat so we can see them, but we'll get to them at the end. And then we'll try to start with questions that might pertain to everyone. And then if you have more specific questions on your application, you can stick around after at the very end, and we hopefully will have some time for those as well. And then also we are recording, right? Yes, we are recording. So if anyone was not able to attend or won't be able to attend for the whole time, we will be posting the link to the recording on our website later this week. Let's go to the next slide, please, Jamie. Thank you. So before we jump into the Restore grant itself, I'm just going to give a quick overview of our organization, Zero Foodprint. So we are primarily an environmental organization, and we are working to change the way food is grown in order to restore the climate. So we raise funds from a variety of sources. We have member businesses that donate a portion of sales. But also individuals might donate. And recently we've gotten a few private grants that have helped as well. And then we pool all those funds and redistribute them as grants to implement conservation practices on working lands, which is, of course, what we're talking about today. So next slide, please. This kind of is a visual of how it all works. So the incoming funds from businesses, that 1% of sales comes to Zero Foodprint and then goes out to farmers and ranchers through these grants of up to $25,000 to implement conservation practices. If you know of anyone who might be interested in joining as a business, really any business can participate anywhere around the country. Many of our businesses are restaurants or other food-related businesses, but they do not have to be. Any kind of business can join. Yes, please come and talk to us if you know of anyone who might be interested in joining, because we're always looking for ways to grow our impact. Next slide. Okay, so now we're getting into Restore, the grant program that I know you all are here to learn about today. The grant is really centered around carbon sequestration, and I'm going to go way more in depth on that a little bit later. But essentially, here's some kind of overview, basic information that you need to know. So when you apply for the grant, you can apply for up to $25,000 to implement anywhere from 1 to a maximum of 4 climate smart farming practices of your choosing. So we use the NRCS definitions of conservation practices, and there is a whole list of the approved practices that is in the grant guidelines on our website. But to give you an idea, it's things like cover cropping, hedgerow establishment, compost, prescribed grazing, cover crops, reduced till, things like that. And so what these have in common is that all of these practices are going to have a direct impact on increasing carbon in the soil. So something like building infrastructure to expand your on-farm composting operation would not qualify for funding, but directly applying that compost directly to your soil would qualify. We do require that you work with a technical assistance provider that will basically sign off at the end that everything has been completed appropriately, and Zero Foodprint covers the cost of technical assistance. So that's why we ask that upfront in the application. And then if you are selected, you will have 12 months to implement the scope of work that you applied for. So just make sure that you are keeping that in mind as you apply. You should pick a scope of work that feels realistic for you to achieve in a year's time, because your award is really tied to that scope of work that you applied for. So once you are awarded, the scope of work cannot change after that. Great. Next slide, please. Okay, eligibility. So the grant is open to anyone who is growing products for human consumption, either food or beverages. So things like fibers or tobacco would not be eligible. And then we do require property owner approval. That's just an attestation on the application. And we ask you to attest that these practices would not be possible without this grant funding. And that's really just to keep ourselves honest in our impact reporting that our funds helped make this um, impact and benefit to the environment possible. So if you have any questions around whether or not you would be eligible, feel free to ask in the chat or shoot us an email at grants@zerofoodprint.org. Always happy to answer. And then as for what funds can be used towards, the grant funds can be used towards any supplies or labor or services or equipment which are required for the completion of the practices awarded. So just note that really large expenses that aren't necessarily tied directly to that soil organic matter could make your grant application a little bit less competitive since we do score projects based on their cost efficiency, which I will be going into more later on. Next slide, please. Okay, technical assistance. So as I said, we do require awardees to work with a technical assistance provider, and they are there to validate that practices have been carried out and in accordance to NRCS practice standards. So this person could be a NRCS staff member or someone from a university extension or a member of a nonprofit that specializes in conservation assistance, or just a really seasoned individual who has a lot of experience providing technical assistance for climate smart agriculture projects in the past. So if you have someone in mind, but you are wondering if they qualify, again, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're happy to answer. And then you will identify who this person is as part of your application and upload a quote from them for their services on the project. And they will basically act as your resource for any on-the-ground technical questions pertaining to practice implementation. And so we really recommend staying in consistent communication with them before and during practice implementation. And then at the end, they will likely conduct a site visit and use that to sign off that everything has been completed as agreed upon, and then that will unlock your final grant payment. What else? Technical assistance does not have to cost anything. There are providers out there that provide this service free of charge. But if there is a cost, Zero Foodprint covers the cost. So that's why we ask for that estimate in the application. All right, next slide, please. Boosts. So there are two ways to get a boost on your application. One way is if you belong to a historically underserved demographic, which you would self-identify on the application, or if you supply one of our member restaurants or businesses. And that one is especially important, I would say, in the Northwest, since that is still a pilot. We predominantly have funding for farmers that are in the supply chain of our donors in the Northwest. But either way, you can get a boost on your application. Either one of these removes 30% from your cost per ton, which I will explain what that means in just a minute. Or if you have both, you would get a 50% off your cost per ton. So now I'm going to explain what that means. Next slide. Okay, so how we score projects. This part is probably the most important part of this presentation. It's kind of a little peek behind the curtain, and I think it's going to really help you immensely when you're applying. So our scoring process is based on the cost per ton of carbon that is projected to be sequestered for each project. So you can kind of think of the cost per ton as like your project's score, and we rank these competitively against each other, or against other applicants in a given round, from lowest to highest. So you want your cost per ton to be as low as possible because that means your application is really cost efficient. So I'll show you how we get that number so that you can calculate it yourself when you apply. So up there at the top, as you can see, we've got the grant project bid. That is the sum of what you're bidding for each practice, which is up to you, since you know best like what it's going to cost for you to implement that practice on your operation. And then plus the cost of technical assistance, which is that quote that will come from your provider. So together, those make up the project cost, which is then divided by the total carbon sequestered. And to get that, we use an online tool called the Comet Planner, which is linked in the application. So you should be able to see that if you've started an application. And that is what helps us estimate how much carbon will be sequestered. So once you know the scope of work you want to apply for, you will input the practice or practices into Comet to estimate the CO2 value. And then we take that number on the back end and multiply it by each practice's lifespan. So you don't have to worry about doing any multiplication. That's already done. But you will just put in what the Comet Planner spits out, and then that will allow the system to run all the calculations it needs to come up with your cost per ton. So I'm going to go more into the Comet Planner in a moment and how that works and answer any questions around that. But essentially, this is just what you need to know, big picture is essentially we just divide the project cost by the CO2 sequestered, get that cost per ton of carbon, which we use to then rank projects from lowest cost per ton to highest cost per ton. And then we fund the projects with the lowest cost per ton. So now you can kind of see how those boosts work in giving you a discount on your cost per ton. It's kind of helping your score get lower and lower and boost you up the ranking. So having gone through all that, let's take a look at some examples. Next slide. Can we go back one slide? I think yeah, okay, great. So this is a example cattle ranch. And as you can see, they're applying for the maximum amount with $2,000 for technical assistance. And they have two practices. Let's just say range planting and prescribed grazing. So together, their practices add up to 200 tons of carbon. So when we do the math, we get about $135 per ton of carbon. So now we're going to take a look at a second example. So this is an almond orchard, and they're applying for the exact same amount, also the maximum, and same amount of technical assistance and they're applying to plant a hedgerow, which is going to sequester 60 tons of CO2 every year for 15 years. And this comes out to 900 tons of carbon. And then we're also going to say that they are a historically underserved producer, so they're getting a boost, which is reducing their cost per ton by 30%. So this second example is a lot more likely to be funded. And so as you can see, it's not so much about like, am I applying for the right practice or, the right amount? It really is about this ratio between how much you're bidding and how much you're sequestering. So if your carbon sequestration value is pretty low, you might consider bidding a little bit less than the maximum to try to even out that ratio in your favor. Or maybe you would cost share, since that's another way to help kind of skew this ratio in your favor. So next slide, I'll go into cost sharing. So cost sharing is one way of making your application more competitive. In order to do it, you would simply identify in the application the true cost of the practice. So let's say you're like, yes, in order to apply this much compost on this many acres, it's going to cost me $5,000. But then when it asks for the bid, you're going to say, I will bid $4,000. And that's what tells us that you're going to cost share that difference, that $1,000. So the cost share can be internal or external, meaning it can come from you or it can come from another grant source. You're absolutely welcome to stack funds. We just ask that you identify the source of the cost share in the application, and that if you are stacking funds with another grant, that you only apply for work that is additional to what you are already going to be carrying out. And then the only other thing to note here is that the cost share cannot exceed 2 times the grant bid. So if you bid $25,000, you couldn't cost share more than $50,000. And that's just to kind of even the playing field, and keep things even. And again, keep ourselves honest with our impact reporting, that we had a big hand in making this work possible. So next, I'm going to go over how to fill out the Comet Planner, which is that carbon sequestration tool I mentioned earlier. So this is what it looks like if you are located in the Northwest or Colorado. There are 2 different Comet Planners. So I'll go over what the California one looks like in a second, but step 1 is just to select your state and your county, and then you will select the type of land that you are looking to, the type of practice that you're looking to do and what kind of land it's on. Next slide. And then this will open up a list of available practices. And once you select the one you want, it might ask you a qualifying question on the right. And then once you fill that out, it should populate the practice below in what looks like a table. So next slide. Yeah, it'll populate the practice in this table and allow you to input the acreage or the linear feet that you're implementing the practice on. And then that number on the right is exactly what you will put into your application when it asks about the COMET number, that total CO2 equivalent. And then if you're applying for more than one practice, you'll just scroll up and repeat those same steps, and it will add the practices in this table. And then when you're done, you'll hit Download Comet Planner and upload that PDF into your application. And then next slide. This is just to show that it looks a little bit different in California, but it's pretty much the same process. Input the county, select the land type, put in the practice. So next slide. And then just note that the payment scenario on the right always needs to be filled out. Sometimes it just means clicking that little switch over, but it won't work if you don't do that. So make sure you do that. And then same thing, next slide, it'll populate onto the table and have the CO2 below. Just note that in this version, there is an estimated payment column, and that is used for other purposes of the Comet Planner, but we do not use this for our grant, so you can disregard it. Essentially for our grants, you determine your cost bid based on your own calculations. So you do not have to put in whatever Comet gives you as the payment amount. All right, next slide. Great. Oh, I should also say, so if you are based in California and you apply to restore to spread purchased compost, then it has to be purchased from a CalRecycle approved facility. And we have a whole list linked in the application so that you can check to make sure. Okay, so compost. Yes, if you're looking to apply compost, things get a little bit granular here. So if you are applying for a standard CDFA application rate, meaning if you are based in California and you apply for compost on annuals or perennials or rangeland at the recommended application rate listed in Comet, then you will just fill out a Comet Planner exactly as I explained above. But if you are looking to apply compost anywhere else outside of California, or if you are applying for a custom application rate that is not the CDFA standard, then you will not need to put that practice into the Comet Planner. Other practices, yes, if you're applying for multiple practices, but not the compost. So we have a different tool that we use to calculate the sequestration value of compost outside of those standard rates. So if you're based in Colorado or the Northwest, or you're in California, but you're looking to apply using a custom application rate, then you will open the compost calculator that is linked in the application, and answer some additional questions about your compost, like the rate of application, the C to N ratio, the C percentage of the compost, and things like that, which all of that you should be able to find in the technical data sheet of the compost, which you can get from your compost supplier. Um, and so I will go over what that all looks like in just a second. And then, yes, as I said, if you purchase compost in California, it must be purchased from a CalRecycle approved facility. So next slide. This is what the linked compost calculator looks like. It was developed using data from the US Compost Council. And so it's just going to ask you a few questions. It's just a few pages. First, it asks you to input your climate type, which you can look up using your zip code. And then next slide, it will ask the acreage of how many acres will receive compost, and then the rate of application in tons per acre. So if you don't know it in tons per acre, there is a calculator that can help you with that conversion if need be. But you'll just need to know the bulk density of the material, which again should be able to be found on the technical data sheet. And then next slide. It asks for the carbon to nitrogen ratio and the percentage of carbon, which are also available on that technical data sheet. And then next slide, it will give you the total CO2 for the entirety of that project. And then we'll give you an option to download. And so be sure to download this since you'll be asked to upload it to your application. But again, this whole calculator is only needed if you are if you are in Colorado or the Northwest and looking to apply compost. All right, next slide. Yes, thank you. So we get a few questions on how to find FSA and APN numbers. So your FSA number is your Farm Service Agency number, and you will only have one if you've received government funding in the past. So if you have, you can access your number at fsa.usda.gov. Otherwise, you probably don't have one. That's fine. You can just leave that blank. And then your APN stands for your assessor parcel number, and everyone should have one. It's for the plot of land that you're farming where these practices will take place. And there might be multiple, but in order to find it, you'll go to the website of your county assessor's office and then type in your address, and it should be able to give them to you. So, and then if you are looking to implement practices across multiple parcel numbers, that's fine. You just put in all the parcel numbers in the application. And if you have any trouble finding either of these, let us know. Happy to help troubleshoot that. All right, next slide. Okay, so lastly, I want to go over some important dates and milestones of the program. So as you may know, this round will close on midnight on February 19th. And then we will score and review and score applications, and decisions will be sent out some point in mid to late March. If you're awarded, you will then sign a contract, probably around late March, early April, and that will trigger your first grant payment to get started on your practices. So that's 50% of the funds upfront. Then once you are underway with your practices, you will send us a pretty simple progress update form, and we will send the next payment, which is 30% of your grant. And then once all practices have been completed, your technical assistance provider will fill out that validation form, and that will unlock your final 20% payment. And then it's not really common, but if soil testing is required for your project, you'll know that in advance. That'll be in your award letter and in your contract if that is needed. And then after this, our next round will likely open around July of this year. So if you are not awarded for this round, you will have the option to resubmit your application or make updates, edits, changes, and then resubmit. And lastly, I just want to plug one of our other programs because if you are in California and you are only looking to apply compost, we do have another program called Compost Connector, which gives a reimbursement on a portion of your compost cost. So if that pertains to you, I'd recommend looking into that. That opens on February 21st. Um, so that concludes the presentation portion. So now I'm gonna jump into questions. Jamie, I don't know if you've been following the questions, but let's see. It looks like, yeah, people have been active in here. That's awesome.
Yeah, I will start. Jojo has patiently had their hand raised, so I'm gonna let them start with a question.
Yes, hi. My name is Jojo, and I'm from California in Auburn. I have a small acreage land, and my goal is to convert this uh, abandoned land into a farm to grow food for the community. Basically, rent it to CSA farms, rent my a plot of land or more to CSA farms. With my research on the CSPs, I tried to look at all of the CSPs and thought that the best CSPs to choose are two CSPs. One is to use the pigs that I already grow to convert the manure into organic compost. And then number two, uh, would be to start planting hedgerows because planting crops alone are just close to ground plants.
So,
Hedgerows will be
Joe,
higher. So
sorry,
it's
I hate to interrupt, but I can kind of see where this is going, and I don't feel comfortable advising what things are best for your land since I'm really not a technical
yeah,
assistant.
okay. I'm gonna go straight to the question.
Okay.
The CSPs that I found are not applicable to my goal, but the overall goal that I have is to what your goal is to create food. I
Mm-hmm.
spoke to a NRCS representative last night, and he said if I am to use the Comet Planner, it lists all of the CSPs, and I have to be exact to the details and the wordings of the CSP, none of which applies to what I need to do. So how am I going to apply and choose what CSP? I went I went to the restore grant application, and the heading, the choices there, find a CSP. What I can use there is mulching because that's basically what I'm doing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, um, if I do that, is that acceptable enough? And how am I going to assess how many tons of carbon sequestration can I do with my goal, my plan, because it's not any one of those CSPs
Yeah.
details.
I will say if a practice is not listed in the Comet Planner, then unfortunately you're not able to apply to the grant for it.
Well,
It sounds like you
well,
and I might want to schedule a one-on-one time to go over like, what your goals are, and we could loop in your technical assistance provider and see if we can come up with a scope of work that does feel useful to your operation that you could apply for. But I want to make sure we're using our time best for questions here and things that are relevant to everyone. And
okay.
so I'm happy to schedule time. If you want to email me at grants@zerofoodprint.org, we can definitely go over all this.
I,
Uh, I'm going to go ahead and move on to a few of the questions in the chat. The first one is, would purchasing equipment for applying compost like a manure spreader qualify?
Yes. So any purchase of equipment or rentals or supplies, labor that is
Sorry, I'm
required.
just in a Zoom meeting. No, you're good. How are you?
Can we ask everyone to mute themselves if they're not talking right now? Thanks. So as long as you are completing the practices that you were awarded for, any
Yeah.
Jamie, can we mute
Yeah, I
everyone?
did, and then it became unmuted.
Okay.
1 second. I'll try again.
So yes, an equipment purchase is eligible to receive grant funding, but I will note that if you have a really large cost for something like equipment purchasing can be very expensive. You'll want to make sure that the compost application that you're looking to do has a strong enough carbon sequestration value to kind of offset that so that you are not making your application less competitive because it's less cost efficient. So yes, it's definitely possible. You just want to make sure that you are doing enough of the carbon sequestering practice so that it doesn't hurt your cost per ton to have a large purchase like that.
Okay. The next question is, does the food need to be sold in order for the grower to qualify? In other words, can the grower qualify if the food they grow is traded, given for free, or consumed on site?
Yes, so food needs to be grown for human consumption, but if that food is donated or otherwise just shared with the community, like you said, traded, that's fine. It just should be entering the food system. So not just like for you and your family.
Next question, what documentation is required from technical assistance providers?
So there's a form at the end, that validation form, that contains a little bit of practice details. So practice implementation details for each practice, some photos, and then a finished comment planner of what was actually completed. Even if it's the exact same as the one used to apply, just that verification that this is what was carried out. And then if you have like an aerial map, there's an optional upload for that, but it's not a requirement. And then I think that's about it. Otherwise, it just asks for your invoice. So we try to keep it a pretty low lift on the reporting side. But photos you want to make sure you're taking photos as the practices are being implemented. So that's something to keep in mind.
For historically underserved, if we are self-identifying, does this need to be tied to the way in which our business is categorized?
Sorry, you said underserved. Does it? No. So we just ask if you are identifying as a historically underserved grower. It will ask what the percentage of business ownership identifies as that category, but that is self-reported.
Next question, what is the lifespan of mulching?
Mulching, I believe, is 1 year.
All right. We are preparing to start growing food again after a fallow period within a vineyard operation. Would we be eligible for the grant to support renewed food production?
Yeah.
Yay.
You're not currently producing food, but you plan to be. Yes, that is eligible.
Good, good, good. It was a sunny day. It was horrible yesterday. It's pouring.
Next question. So the practice implementation for the equation comes from the comment planner and is not referring to the 12-month implementation timeline.
Exactly. Yes. Yes, and just to clarify, the practice lifespan that is associated with each practice, NRCS, I believe, determines the practice lifespans. So if you go to the grant guidelines at the very bottom, there's a list of all the eligible practices, and that has the lifespan of each practice listed on the right side, if that's helpful to see.
Next question, tons per acre or tons per treated acre for the compost?
So that should be of the land that you are planning to apply compost. What is the tonnage per each 1 acre that you, am I answering this right? So it's not
Yeah,
for your entire operation, it is for the practice, the land that is going to be treated with compost. What is the tonnage per acre of that land?
yeah. Henry, if that did not answer your question, feel free to hop on and clarify. Next question, what technical assistance is required of our technical assistance providers, such as Regional Soil and Water Conservation District? Is it up to us to decide what exact technical assistance we are asking for, or are there other requirements from Zero Foodprint?
So is this asking about what qualifies as a technical assistance provider? Is that the gist of the question?
Can I chime in?
Sure.
Yeah, no, the question is, I have a technical assistance provider on board. It's our Soil and Water Conservation District. And they're like, okay, great. What technical assistance do you need? I mean, as far as implementing it, I mean, frankly, we don't need, like, from our perspective, we don't need any of their technical assistance, but I understand you guys want us to have that. So what is the requirement of them? Like, we know how to implement these practices. What do you guys require of them? What am I specifically going to ask them to do? Is it just essentially track, photograph, and confirm that we're implementing?
Yes. So in the beginning, they will sign up, they'll look at all of your scope of work and the practices you're looking to implement and just give a little like, yep, that sounds good, that we recommend that for your land, things like that. So they will sign the contract as well, basically signing off that the scope of work looks good. And then, right, they might take photos throughout. They're there for questions. It doesn't sound like you need it. And then at the end, they will submit that validation form with the photos and the more details and things, just to validate that everything was carried out and, you know, to the correct standard and in the way that is set out in the contract. So it's there. They're there to also be a kind of unbiased third party. Since we don't ever do site visits, we're not really there on the ground. It's nice to have someone who is there on the ground who's able to kind of validate everything for us.
So just to confirm, I mean, it can be like a pretty low touch relationship. We know them, they know us pretty well. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Great. Next question, if one CalRecycle compost vendor is chosen during the application process, but the grower ends up using a different one, is that a problem?
No, not as long as they're both CalRecycle approved vendors. That shouldn't be a problem.
Next question, what is the cancellation process of the contract if we choose not to move forward if awarded?
It kind of depends on what stage. If you cancel before the contract is signed, then it's no problem. If you cancel after the contract is signed, then would just be a little bit more of a case by case basis. But it has rarely ever happened and hopefully won't. So, but we will work with you to find a solution.
Next question is a clarification on the deadline. Is midnight on February 19th, 11:59 on 2/19 or 12:01 on February 19th?
So by 12:01 a.m. on February 20th, you are no longer able to submit an application. I hope that answers the question.
How specific should the practice bid be?
So I would say, to the nearest whole dollar for sure. And if you would like, you're able to add in a little bit of buffer for yourself. And, you might say, I've crunched some of the numbers. I know about what this is going to cost, but prices might rise in the next couple months. So, in order to make sure I can carry out this this practice, I'm going to give myself, you know, couple $100 buffer. You are absolutely able to do that. You just don't want to overdo that too much because of the way our projects are scored. As I've gone through, it is a matter of cost efficiency. So, yeah, I would just ask you to do your best to be as accurate as possible. But we understand that that can be challenging, but just do your best.
What is the project duration for compost application?
So for all practices, all projects, it is 12, you have 12 months to implement any and all practices. If you know, really just need it for the next few months and you think you'll be done in a few months, great, that's fine. You're welcome to finish the project early and submit all your materials, and that's fine. So it's really just the 12-month deadline.
The next question is, where can we find a list of CalRecycle approved compost facilities?
That is on our website, but it is also linked in the application. So I think it's easier to find it in the application, but you'll have to start filling in information and say compost and, you know, select a few things, and then it will come up.
I may have missed this since I joined a few minutes late, but are projects with a cost share prioritized or considered more competitive? Also, what is the best way to make an application for a small farm more competitive? And there were a few questions about smaller farms, so maybe speak to that for a minute.
Yeah, definitely. So cost sharing, I do recommend because it reduces your overall cost per ton, which is kind of your project's score. So, you know, I don't want to encourage everyone to overdo it. You should only cost share what you feel comfortable with. But it definitely is one way of increasing your likelihood of being funded. And then I'll just say more broadly, for smaller projects, it can be a little bit difficult to put together an application that has a strong enough carbon sequestration value when you're working with a really small acreage. But having said that, it's definitely not impossible. We have awarded and funded many operations that are, you know, less than 10 acres. I think it's just a matter of being smart about the practices that you're applying for. So looking at some of those that have longer lifespans, oftentimes it's like the woody biomass planting practices tend to have longer lifespans. So you get kind of that multiplier effect on your carbon sequestration value. And then also just knowing that you may have to, you know, pare down the amount that you are requesting in order to match that carbon sequestration value. So oftentimes smaller operations will be awarded for smaller grants, like, you know, $2,000 to $5,000 or something like that.
I'm farming on half acre and using the Comet calculator. It seems too small for any score. Is there a minimum acreage?
There's not a minimum acreage, but if you are coming up with like all zeros for in the Comet planner, then I would recommend considering other practices that might be able to get you at least like a 1 or a 2 of a carbon sequestration score. At least that is kind of more workable. So if you would like, again, we can talk one-on-one and talk through what might be feasible on your land. But yeah, it would be difficult to be awarded with a carbon sequestration value of 0. So yeah, that's definitely important.
The next couple of questions are all about compost, so I'm going to kind of combine them. What are the requirements for compost application? What is the lifespan of compost? And then the next one is, compost is usually a 3-year implementation practice through HSP, but will all this be done in a 1-year application?
Yes, so the grants is only for 1 year of practice implementation. Within that, I know some people apply compost multiple times a year, so I don't know if that's of interest, but if you would like to apply compost, you know, once in the spring and once in the fall, that would count within the 1 year timelines, but we do not award for anything beyond 1 year. However, you can always reapply if you're awarded and get another grant for next year's compost application. You can apply up to 3 times, or sorry, I should reword that. There's a lifetime maximum of $75,000. So if you have not reached that threshold, you are always welcome to reapply once you have completed your scope of work from the last grant. And then going back to some of the other questions, it was around
The lifespan of compost and requirements for compost applications, maybe application rates or practice standards.
Okay. So the lifespan of compost varies depending on the land type. If it's going to be applied to annual crops, it's 1 year. And then I believe perennials is 3 years. And rangeland, I believe it varies depending on if you're using the CDFA standard or the Riles and Silver standard. But they should all be in that document I mentioned that's at the bottom of our grant guidelines that has all the eligible practices and their lifespan. So I'm happy to share that in the chat at the end, or that's also available on our website on the grant guidelines. And then as for application rate, the CDFA has outlined, so this is California only that I'm talking about, has outlined standards for applications over annual crops, perennial crops, and rangeland. And it depends on if you are applying high C to N ratio or low C to N ratio compost. So if you are, you can see in the comment planner once you fill out more information, the application rates that they recommend, and you can select one. Other than that, I can't really say, an application rate that I recommend because I'm not don't have that kind of expertise. So if you're wondering about what application rate you should apply for, I would more talk to your technical assistance provider. But I will say if you are based in California, I would try to apply for a standard CDFA rate rather than doing a custom rate. Because I think the CO2 sequestration might be a bit better with a CDFA standard rate.
All right, next question. What type of practices count as nutrient management, amino acid blends, seaweed applications to orchards?
Yeah, so nutrient management is largely, from my understanding, about reducing fertilizer inputs and replacing that with something else, whether it be compost, manure, some other kind of fertility enhancer. Though I'm actually not sure if some of those things mentioned, if those count under nutrient management. That would be more of a technical assistance provider question. Or reach out to me after if you have questions about that, because I might be able to find out how the Comet Planner is kind of defining some of these practices. But yeah, that's what I'm going off of. So technical assistance provider is probably the better source of info.
Next questions, actually, there were sort of two that were the same, which is what is a competitive dollar amount per ton of CO2?
Yeah, that's kind of the golden question. And I get that question a lot. And it's really, really, really difficult to say because it totally varies based on what state are you in, how many people have applied for this round, how much funding do we have to distribute, how competitive of applications have we received. So not just quantity, but quality of applications. And oftentimes we really don't know that until all applications have been submitted. So, I mean, I can say that you definitely want to be like under $100 a ton for sure. Under 50 is probably even better, but it really really varies. And I mean that because there are a few other scoring criteria that go into this. Every once in a while, we might have like a regional cutout where we have more funds in one region than another region. And so even if the cost per ton isn't as high, we're going to fund this project, or even if the cost per ton isn't as low, we're going to fund this project because we have funding for this region or something like that. So I hesitate to give an exact amount because lower is always better, but even if you can't get it super, super, super low, I think it's still always just worth submitting an application because you never know. Yeah.
All right. What kind of proof of right to manage land is required? Does a lease suffice?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you do not need to own the land that you are managing in order to apply. And we won't even ask for the, proof of your lease or anything. We just ask that you attest that you have the owner's permission to be working this land and doing these practices.
The next one is a request for a copy of the TAP verification form. I asked a technical service provider and they wanted to know what was going to be required.
Yeah, you are always welcome to put them directly in touch with me. Again, that's grants@zerofoodprint.org. That's a very common question. Of course, they want to know what the reporting requirements are, and I'm always happy to answer that directly and provide, like you said, more information like the TAP form. And we have a manual for TAPs that we've provided that has kind of all the basic information that they need to know. So I'm happy to send them that as well.
What if we just purchased a used compost spreader? Can we include that as a reimbursement?
No, unfortunately, we don't offer funding as reimbursements for anything that was purchased before the grant was submitted, so that would not count. But if you're using it to apply compost, then you can apply for that compost application and receive funding for that.
Is there a budget cap on TAP costs?
No, there is not a budget cap on TAP costs. Basically, even if the TAP cost is higher, and if your application is still competitive, that's fine. But I will say sometimes if the TAP cost is too high, it can kind of start to disadvantage the application. So that is just something to keep in mind. Maybe you'd want to shop around if someone gave you a really high quote. But usually we don't really see that very much. Yeah, usually I'd say TAP costs are within like 15 to 20% of the bid. That's usually kind of the normal rate. So,
Okay. Would you consider biochar as compost?
unfortunately, no. I wish. I know there's so much cool science coming out around biochar, but we just don't have the data to know what that's sequestering. It's not in the COMET planner yet. And so as much as we would really like to be able to fund biochar, it's not one of our eligible practices at this time.
Can we include 4 practices and will that help our application be more competitive?
Yeah, the answer is potentially, but not necessarily, because like I showed, the way we score it, it really is just about the ratio of what you're bidding to what you're sequestering. So in theory, like you could apply for 4 practices, but if all 4 have a really weak carbon sequestration value and they're costing you a lot to implement, then having all 4 won't help you. But if adding another one, if you are at 2 practices and you go, you know what, actually I could add this third and it wouldn't cost too much, then maybe that additional boost of CO2 would help the application. So not necessarily, but potentially that's something you could consider if you are looking to add more carbon sequestration.
All right. Is there a minimum amount of carbon sequestration estimated by the COMET planner or acreage that is necessary to qualify? If we are currently working on NRCS on other conservation practices and would like to add an additional practice through this grant, can they be added together to calculate the carbon sequestration in the planner?
So I'll start with the first part of that question, which is there a minimum CO2 amount required to apply? I guess not really, not to apply. But if we're talking about being awarded, then I mean, at least one. And if it's, ideally a longer lifespan practice, you get a multiplier on that. It might become 15 or something like that. So yeah, you definitely want that higher if you can. Um, and then remind me, the second part of that question was,
If we're currently working with NRCS on other practices, can we include them in the sequestration in the planner?
so I'll answer this two ways. One, we do ask that any of the practices that you apply for this grant are additional to work that is already being done or planning to be done. And that's so that, we can claim credit for having an environmental impact that is apart from the status quo of what would have already been done. But I'll also say, if you are, like, let's say you were awarded through another grant, like Healthy Soils grant or something like that, um, you could apply for work that is additional to that scope of work that you had already laid out. So for instance, what I mean by that is, if you were awarded to apply compost to 10 acres and you figure, well, I'm already getting the spreading guy to come out on this day and I'm already, doing all this. So if I could get a little bit more money, I could increase that to 15 or 20 acres of compost, or I might be able to apply 8 tons an acre of compost instead of 6 tons an acre of compost. Um, so things like that, that maybe you were already kind of planning on doing the practice, but now you're able to do more of the practice, that would be eligible to count for the grant.
Okay, next one, avocado grower here. To confirm, I can use the grant to apply to plant different plants in the spaces I have available within my trees.
Yes, I would check with your technical assistance provider to make sure that falls within one of the approved practices. I'm guessing that would be something like alley cropping or something like that. Um, and one other thing to note is just that, unfortunately, not all eligible practices are available in all counties in Comet. So you'll want to make sure when you apply that what you're looking to do is eligible and available in Comet in your specific county. But yes, as long as that qualifies as one of the approved practices, then yeah, absolutely.
You've already spoke about this a little bit, but there's another question. Could we get a list of things we need to get the TAP to do?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So if you don't apply this round, you can apply in July for the next round. And can the TAP be an employee of the farming operation?
No, so the TAP has to be a third party, so not employed by the farming operation.
All right. Next question is about compost. What does the C to N ratio refer to? Does this refer to the compost, to the soil, or what?
Yes, that refers to the carbon to nitrogen ratio of the compost. So higher nitrogen compost tends to be more like manure heavy, I believe, and higher carbon compost is more like green waste plant material, I believe. So which one is right for your land, again, is going to be a question for your technical assistance provider. But they are just slightly different in how the CDFA treats them in terms of like recommended application rates and things. So you'll want to find out which one is right for your land, identify, which compost product you'll be sourcing from your vendor, and then you'll be able to apply once you know those.
Can we include the cost of our labor?
Yes, you can. That can absolutely be included in the bid. Yeah, factored into that.
Could the cost share amounts be a similar award from the NRCS?
Sorry, say it again. I don't think I understand the
Can
question.
the cost share amount be a similar award from the NRCS?
Can the cost share amount be a similar award from the NRCS? Could you, question writer, could you?
Heather and Audrey, do you want to, if you're still here, unmute?
I didn't write the question, but I'm a former NRCS employee. It's usually a cost share of 75% of the total practice, budget.
Just chiming in, I think they might be asking if you've already received a grant or an award from NRCS. Can that count as your cost share?
Oh, okay. If that is the question, then yes, absolutely. That can be an external source of cost sharing. Yeah.
The next question is, what have the historic awarded values been? James, do you mean like how much funding is typically given out?
Or the cost per ton averages from previous
Yeah, the
rounds?
cost per ton averages is
Okay.
the question.
Yeah, it totally varies from round to round. But I think past averages, I think in California, it's usually a little bit lower. We tend to see more competitiveness in California. So anywhere from like $20 a ton to $50 a ton, somewhere in there. And then Colorado typically used to be a little bit higher. I will say I think that's kind of changing as more people are hearing about the grants. So that number has also been dropping. And then the Northwest, it's really too soon to tell, I think, because it's a pilot. We've only done one round before, and I don't even really know what the average cost per ton was of that. So yeah.
I just want to check on time because there's about a dozen more questions. Are you happy to keep going, Alana, or do you want to?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm good on time.
Okay. The next question, if I want to do the woody planting and compost connector, do I apply in the same place? I ask in regards to the COMET calculator.
So you do not need to fill out a COMET planner in order to apply for the compost connector program. And while you are able to apply to and receive both programs, you cannot use them for the same compost application. So it sounds like you're just looking to apply for compost connector for compost and then restore for a different practice. I will say if you would like, you're welcome to apply to restore for compost as well, because it might cover more of your compost costs than compost connector would. But it's up to you. Again, you're welcome to apply to both, so it might just be worth applying for compost for both programs. Does that answer the full question? I forgot if there was another piece.
That is it. The next one is, what is the total award budget for this round of the program? Oh. Sorry.
Total, all good. We will be giving out $300,000 across all regions for this round.
What if our farm has multiple land uses like grazing land and cropland?
Absolutely fine. You're welcome to apply for practices on the grazing land and practices on the cropland. So when you do the COMET planner, you would just reselect the land type at the top before you go down and fill out the rest of the information. But yeah, you can house multiple land types in one COMET planner and one application.
If part of a project proposal involves adding compost and mulch under existing rows of mature redwood trees on a property border in order to improve their growing conditions and resist drought stress, can the carbon sequestration value of the redwood trees be considered?
No, because that is not additional. So those were pre-existing, I guess I should say. And since we just don't have, I don't have data on that. Basically, we need an additional practice to be implemented, and we run all the sequestration values through COMET, as you saw, or the other composts calculator. So no, I don't think there's a way to factor in the carbon sequestration that the redwoods are sequestering.
Next one is, so for compost application for perennial crops in California, we multiply our total CO2 equivalent by 3 since the lifespan is 3 years.
Thank you for asking this. So no, you do not. What I showed you was kind of the back end of how we score projects. But we have a system that takes into account the lifespan of the practice when you select it. So you don't have to worry about doing any multiplication. That is done in our system when we score projects. So you just input the CO2 value that Comet spits out into where it says CO2 in the application. And it will be multiplied by 3. So you'll see at the bottom of the application when it does all the calculations and shows you what your CO2 is, what your cost per ton is. You'll see it reflected there, and you'll know that it worked.
Next question, who owns the carbon credits generated by this program?
You
And
do.
I will say, Alana, Anthony's also on this call. Our executive director is happy to jump in and answer any questions about carbon credits too.
Oh, thanks, Jamie. Yeah, so you would own any carbon credits that you potentially would like to go after. We just have a rule or ask that if you were to profit off of those, that you return the grant funds that made that practice possible. Assuming your carbon credits are, profitable, then you could probably still take home some funds from that, even after returning those grant funds. So it is yet to happen yet, but you are definitely able to still pursue carbon credits from work that was carried out using these grant funds. Anthony, if you would like to add to that, you're welcome to.
I'll just say quickly, great answer. And I think that an example can sometimes help. So let's say that you received a grant from Zero Foodprint for $20,000 to implement a project that sequestered 1,000 tons of carbon. Let's say you managed the carbon credit process yourself. That's not what we're doing. And then let's say you eventually sold the carbon credits for $50,000. We would ask that you reimburse Zero Foodprint the $20,000 so that we can then re-grant it to somebody else. And then also so that you are sort of like in compliance with carbon market protocols or requirements or whatever, and you're not sort of like double dipping or something along those lines. But we're glad to kind of discuss that further and help you strategize so that it doesn't kind of like prevent you from, maximizing your profit or doing whatever.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Anthony. At the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned that the grant is prioritized for farms that wouldn't otherwise be able to implement the practice. How is that ability determined?
So it's actually not only that we prioritize, it's that only farms that attest that they would not be able to do the practices without the funding are eligible to receive the funding. I will say that's an honor system. There's an attestation in the application that asks you to attest that. And please do be honest, because we're really trying to have a positive impact here. And so if there are things that would have been carried out regardless of whether or not the grant funds were awarded, then that's really not in the spirit of what we're looking to fund. So.
Next question. So compost that is being delivered before the grant gets awarded will not qualify.
Exactly. Correct.
Do we need to pay the TAP if we do not get the fund, get the award? Who's going to pay the TAP?
No, so I think this refers to maybe if you work closely with a technical assistance provider in putting together your application. That I'm not sure how they do the billing on that, to be honest. But if you are not awarded from our perspective, then there was no work carried out for the TAP to be paid for from our end. But if you are awarded, Zero Foodprint covers the cost of the TAP services in entirety. So that's why we ask for that quote upfront and why it's factored into the total cost of your project.
Are receipts showing proof of purchase of plants, compost, labor, etc. required for verification?
Yes, if you have any invoices, we do ask that you submit those. It's not always a requirement because, for instance, you may have applied for on-farm produced compost, and so there's no invoice to be shown in that case. But if you did purchase, supplies, any sort of services, equipment, things like that, and you have an invoice, we do ask that you submit it if you have it.
Let's see here. For the different practices, is the grant payment based on dollars per acre similar to HSP grants, or is the payment based on invoices, receipts?
I believe neither. So
Yeah.
the grant, you determine the grant